If you were standing at a Greyhound terminal in the summer of 1954, you weren't just waiting for a bus, you were waiting for the future. Rolling toward the platform was a machine that looked like it had been sliced directly out of a science fiction magazine. It was 40 feet of shimmering, fluted aluminum, towering over everything else on the road. It had 2 levels, a panoramic upper deck encased in green-tinted glass, and a presence that commanded absolute silence from the crowd. This was the GM PD 4501, better known to the world as the Scenicruiser. It was the most recognizable bus ever built, a land yacht that promised to revolutionize American travel with air-conditioned luxury, onboard restrooms, and a ride so smooth you could sleep through a cross-country trip. But if you looked closer, past the Raymond Loewy styling and the gold stripes, you might have noticed something strange. As the driver idled at the curb, the rear of the bus didn't just hum, it shuddered. If you were a mechanic standing near the engine bay, you wouldn't hear the rhythmic thrum of a single powerful heart. You would hear a chaotic, syncopated clatter, the sound of 2 separate engines fighting against each other. Behind that beautiful, futuristic skin lay a mechanical Frankenstein, a drivetrain so complex, so ill-conceived, and so prone to catastrophic failure that it nearly bankrupted the most powerful bus company on Earth. This is the story of how Greyhound's greatest dream became its most expensive nightmare. To understand why the Scenicruiser was built this way, we have to understand the terrifying position Greyhound found itself in during the early 1950s. For decades, they had been the undisputed kings of the highway, but the world was changing fast. The interstate highway system was on the horizon, promising endless ribbons of concrete that would allow private families to drive their own Chevys and Fords from coast to coast without stopping. At the same time, the skies were opening up. Commercial aviation was becoming faster and cheaper. Greyhound realized that if they didn't offer something radically different, something that felt like an experience rather than just transportation, they would become obsolete. They needed a flagship. They didn't just want a better bus, they wanted a vehicle that would make the passenger feel like a VIP. The mandate came directly from Greyhound's president, Orville Caesar, a man known for his ruthless pragmatism and mechanical curiosity. Caesar didn't want a slightly updated version of the old Silversides bus. He wanted a quantum leap. To achieve this, he did something unprecedented. He partnered with General Motors for the engineering, but for the soul of the machine, he hired the most famous industrial designer in the world, Raymond Loewy. Loewy was the man who had styled the Coca-Cola bottle, the Lucky Strike pack, and the Studebaker. He understood that in the 1950s, appearance was everything. He sketched a vision of a bus that looked like a streamliner train, with a raised observation deck that gave passengers a view of the American landscape that no car could match. But drawing a futuristic bus is one thing, building it is another. The road to the Scenicruiser was paved with failed experiments, the most significant being the GX1 prototype. If you think the final Scenicruiser was ambitious, the GX1 was bordering on insanity. Developed in the late 1940s, the GX1 was a true double-decker, not the split-level design we know today. It was a monster. It had a lower lounge, an upper observation deck, and it was powered by 2 air-cooled aircraft engines. Yes, aircraft engines. Caesar was obsessed with the idea of redundancy. If one engine failed, the bus could limp home on the other. But the GX1 had a fatal flaw. It was too tall. At over 13 feet high, it couldn't fit into many of Greyhound's existing garages or under older bridges. It was a technological marvel that was operationally useless. Caesar scraped the GX1, but he didn't scrap the dream. He ordered a redesign, which became the GX2. This was the birth of the deck-and-a-half layout. By lowering the front section and raising only the rear, they solved the height problem while keeping the observation car feel. The GX2 was a triumph of packaging. It stretched the legal limits of the time, measuring a full 40 feet long, when most states only allowed 35. Greyhound actually had to lobby state legislatures individually to change the laws just so this bus could legally drive on the roads. That is the level of power Greyhound wielded in the 1950s. By 1954, the design was finalized. The visual identity was perfect. The Scenicruiser name was painted in gold script on the side. The interior featured crazy new fabrics designed to hide cigarette burns and wear, and the air conditioning system was powerful enough to cool a small house. But as the launch date approached, a dark cloud hung over the engineering department at General Motors. The problem was the engine. Or rather, the lack of one. The Scenicruiser was a heavy beast. Fully loaded with 43 passengers, luggage, and a full tank of fuel, it weighed over 30,000 pounds. To move that much metal at highway speeds, and importantly, to climb the Rockies and the Appalachians without slowing down to a crawl, Greyhound calculated they needed at least 300 horsepower. Today, 300 horsepower is nothing. A modern pickup truck has more. But in 1954, that was a massive figure for a diesel engine. And General Motors, the largest company in the world, did not have an engine that could do it. GM's workhorse engine was the Detroit Diesel 6-71, an inline six-cylinder two-stroke diesel. It was reliable, tough, and loud, but it only produced about 190 to 200 horsepower. It wasn't enough. The engineers looked at the drawing board. They couldn't use a gasoline engine because the fuel economy would be terrible. They needed a big diesel V8, but the legendary Detroit Diesel 8V71 was still years from production. So they made a choice that would doom the Scenicruiser to a decade of ridicule. If one engine wasn't enough, they would use two. This wasn't just a matter of bolting two engines into the back. It was an engineering high-wire act. GM decided to take two smaller engines, the Detroit Diesel 471, a four-cylinder inline engine used in farm tractors and small boats, and mount them side by side in the rear of the bus. On paper, the math worked. Two engines, each making about 150 horsepower, would combine to give the Scenicruiser the 300 horsepower it needed to conquer the mountains. But how do you connect two separate engines to a single transmission? You can't just weld the crankshafts together. The solution GM came up with was a fluid coupling, a device filled with hydraulic fluid that was supposed to smooth out the differences between the two engines before sending the power to a massive clutch. It was complex, heavy, and totally unproven in this kind of application. To make matters worse, the transmission itself was a nightmare. It was a 3-speed manual gearbox, but it had a splitter unit on the back, effectively giving it 6 gears. The driver had to operate a manual stick shift, a clutch pedal, and a splitter switch, all while managing a vehicle that was 5 feet longer than anything they had ever driven. When the first PD 4501s rolled off the assembly line in Pontiac, Michigan, they looked perfect. The press cheered. The public lined up to buy tickets. Greyhound launched a massive advertising blitz, calling it the era of the Scenicruiser. But almost immediately, the calls started coming in from the drivers. The buses weren't just breaking down, they were self-destructing. The twin-engine concept, which was supposed to be the Scenicruiser's superpower, was turning into its Achilles heel. The first sign of trouble wasn't a noise, it was a vibration so intense that it would crack the aluminum skin of the bus. The vibration that drivers felt wasn't just a rattle, it was a harmonic dissonance that started in the soles of their feet and worked its way up to their teeth. It was the physical manifestation of two mechanical beasts trying to tear each other apart. The root of the problem lay in the concept of synchronization. For the twin-engine setup to work, both Detroit Diesel 471 engines had to be running at exactly the same RPM, producing exactly the same amount of torque at exactly the same moment. In a laboratory setting, with a team of white-coated engineers hovering over gauges, this was possible. On a dusty highway in Arizona, with a bus that had already clocked 50,000 hard miles, it was a fantasy. The issue was the governors. Diesel engines rely on mechanical governors to regulate fuel delivery and engine speed, but these governors were analog, mechanical devices. They drifted.
If the left engine's governor was set just a fraction differently than the right engine's, or if one throttle linkage was slightly stickier than the other, the engines would fall out of phase. The result was a beat frequency. Instead of a smooth power delivery, the engines would fight the fluid coupling connecting them. One engine would effectively try to push the bus, while the other, lagging just milliseconds behind, acted as a momentary brake. This push-pull conflict happened thousands of times per minute. This didn't just annoy the passengers, it destroyed the bus. The torsional vibration hammered the drivetrain components. Universal joints would shatter, clutch plates would wear out in a fraction of their expected lifespan, bolts would back themselves out of their threads. There were reports of Scenicruisers arriving at terminals with body panels literally shaken loose from the frame. The land yacht was vibrating itself into a pile of scrap metal. And then there was the transmission. General Motors had equipped the Scenicruiser with a Spicer manual transmission. It was a 3-speed box with a 2-speed splitter, giving the drivers 6 forward ratios. But unlike the cars of the era, this transmission was non-synchronized. Non-synchronized is a polite engineering term for unforgiving. It meant the driver couldn't just push the clutch and move the lever. They had to double clutch. To shift up, you press the clutch, pull the gear lever into neutral, release the clutch, wait for the engine RPM to drop to the perfect matching speed for the next gear, press the clutch again, and slide it into gear. Now, imagine doing that with 2 engines that are already fighting each other while piloting a 40-foot bus filled with 43 people navigating a steep downgrade in the Rockies. If a driver missed a shift, if they ground the gears, the shockwave would send a shudder through the entire drivetrain that could snap an axle. Drivers who were used to the older, simpler buses found themselves physically exhausted after a shift. They weren't just driving, they were wrestling a machine that seemed to actively hate them.
Greyhound's marketing materials had proudly touted the dependability of the twin engines. The logic was simple. If one engine failed, the other could power the bus to the next town. It was a brilliant safety net on paper. In reality, it was a lie. The Scenicruiser was heavy. It was built with steel monocoque construction and loaded with heavy amenities like the air conditioning units and the restroom holding tanks. If one of the 471 engines died, the remaining 4-cylinder engines simply didn't have the torque to move the dead weight of the bus and the drag of the failed engine through the fluid coupling. Instead of limping home, the bus would be stranded. Or worse, the driver would try to push the single surviving engine to its absolute limit to keep moving, causing it to overheat and fail as well. The redundancy was a myth. A dead engine was just an anchor. But the drivetrain wasn't the only source of the mechanic's misery. The Scenicruiser was designed to be a power-assisted dream. And to achieve this, GM designed a centralized hydraulic system. In modern vehicles, systems are separated. Your power steering fluid never touches your brake fluid. In the Scenicruiser, almost everything ran off a single, massive, high-pressure hydraulic loop. The power steering, the windshield wipers, the radiator cooling fans, and even the brakes were all tied into this web of hoses and pumps. The system held gallons of hydraulic fluid pressurized to over 1,500 psi. It was an engineering marvel of integration, but it was a maintenance catastrophe. If a seal blew on a windshield wiper motor, the bus didn't just lose its wipers. The system would bleed pressure, potentially affecting the cooling fans or the steering assist. Mechanics nicknamed the Scenicruiser the Scenic Leaker because the fluid found every possible way to escape. Maintenance pits and Greyhound garages turned into oil slicks. The complexity was so high that many local mechanics who were used to hitting things with hammers until they worked simply didn't know how to fix it. They would patch leaks with tape or use the wrong type of fluid, which would eat through the rubber seals, causing even more leaks. Then came the fuel consumption. Greyhound was a business, and businesses run on margins. The twin 471 engines were thirsty. Because they were often running out of sync and fighting the fluid coupling, they burned more diesel than a single larger engine would have. The Scenicruiser was achieving roughly 4 to 5 miles per gallon, dismal even for the 1950s. When you multiplied that by a fleet of 1,000 buses running millions of miles a year, the fuel bill alone was enough to make the accountants weep. Yet, amidst this mechanical carnage, a strange paradox emerged.
the passengers loved it. Up on the top deck, isolated from the driver's struggle and the mechanic's curse, the public saw none of this. To them, the vibration was just the powerful thrum of a mighty machine. They sat in the skylight level, peering through that green-tinted glass at the passing cornfields and cityscapes. The air conditioning, when the hydraulic fans were working, was ice cold. The suspension, riding on air-ride bellows, another new and temperamental technology, floated over bumps that would have jarred the teeth out of a passenger in an older bus. The marketing had worked too well. The public demanded the Scenicruiser. They would let other buses pass them by at the station, waiting specifically for the gold-striped bus. This put Greyhound in a terrible bind. They had a product that was a commercial smash hit, but an operational failure. They couldn't pull the buses off the road because they were the face of the company, but keeping them on the road was costing a fortune in repairs, towing fees, and refunds for stranded passengers. Tensions between the drivers and the maintenance crews reached a boiling point. Drivers blamed the mechanics for sending out broken buses. Mechanics blamed the drivers for lugging the engines and stripping the gears. The Greyhound garages became battlegrounds, and in the corporate offices, the panic was setting in. The Scenicruiser fleet was still brand new, yet some units were spending more time in the shop than on the highway. The warranty claims submitted to General Motors were stacking up on desks like skyscrapers. Something had to break. And eventually, it wasn't a gear or a shaft. It was the patience of Greyhound's leadership. The situation was spiraling from a maintenance headache into a full-blown PR crisis. Stories of passengers stranded on the side of the road in the blistering heat were starting to make the papers. The icon of America was becoming the joke of the highway. But just when they thought it couldn't get worse, the Scenicruiser revealed one final, terrifying trick. The vibration and the leaking fluids were bad, but they were manageable. What happened next was not. The twin engines tucked tightly into the rear compartment generated an immense amount of heat. The ventilation was marginal at best. When you combined overheating engines with leaking hydraulic fluid spraying onto hot exhaust manifolds, the result was inevitable. The Scenicruisers started catching fire. It wasn't an epidemic, but it happened often enough to terrify the executives in Chicago. A leaking high-pressure hydraulic line would mist flammable fluid onto a superheated turbocharger or exhaust manifold, and in seconds, the entire rear of the bus would be engulfed. Passengers would scramble out the side doors, watching their luggage and the future of travel turn into a charred skeleton on the shoulder of Route 66. The fires were the final straw. The Scenicruiser had gone from a mechanical nuisance to a liability. Greyhound was bleeding money, paying for tow trucks, replacement buses, and damage control. The dream was dead. Now it was just about survival. Behind closed doors, the relationship between Greyhound and General Motors had turned toxic. Greyhound felt betrayed. They had paid a premium for a revolutionary vehicle and received a prototype that wasn't ready for the real world. GM, for their part, argued that Greyhound's drivers were abusing the equipment and that their maintenance schedules were lax. But no amount of finger-pointing could solve the physics problem. 2 engines were simply too many. The twin 471 experiment was an objective failure. By the late 1950s, Greyhound faced a choice: scrap the entire fleet of 1001 Scenicruisers, a move that would cost millions and likely end the careers of everyone involved, or find a way to fix them. They chose the latter. They didn't just need a repair, they needed a heart transplant. Fortunately, technology had finally caught up with their ambition. While the Scenicruiser was struggling through its early years, Detroit Diesel had been hard at work in the lab. They had finally perfected the engine that the Scenicruiser should have had from day one, the 8V71. The 8V71 is, without exaggeration, one of the most legendary engines in history. It was a V8 diesel, 2 banks of 4 cylinders sharing a single crankshaft. It was loud. It leaked oil as a matter of course, leading to the old mechanics joke, if there's no oil under a Detroit, there's no oil in it. But it was bulletproof. It produced roughly 318 horsepower naturally aspirated. It was simple, it was brutal, and most importantly, it was one engine. No fluid couplings, no synchronization issues, no governors fighting each other. Just one massive block of iron churning out torque. In 1961, Greyhound initiated what was arguably the most ambitious retrofit program in the history of commercial transportation. This wasn't a recall, it was a remanufacturing effort. They contracted with the Marmon Harrington Company, a firm famous for building all-wheel drive conversions in military vehicles, to overhaul the fleet. The scale of the operation was staggering. Scenicruisers were pulled from service in rotations and sent to the workshops. The mechanics stripped the engine bays. They ripped out the twin 471s, the heavy fluid couplings, and the complex linkages. They cut into the rear subframe to make room for the wider V8. The 8V71 was shoehorned into the back. It was a tight fit, but it fit. But they didn't stop at the engine. The hated 3-speed transmission with the splitter box was thrown onto the scrap pile. In its place, they installed a robust 4-speed manual Spicer transmission. This was a non-synchronized box, yes, but it was a traditional, honest gearbox. It didn't have a splitter. It didn't require the driver to flip switches while shifting. It just had 4 forward gears. First to get moving, second for the city, third for the on-ramp, and fourth for the highway. It was simple, heavy, and nearly indestructible. The transformation went deeper. The nightmare of the centralized hydraulic system was dismantled. The accessories that didn't need hydraulic power were converted to electric or air-driven systems. The cooling fans, which had been a constant source of trouble, were redesigned. The scenic leaker was slowly being sealed up. When the buses rolled out of the Marmon Harrington shops, they looked the same on the outside, save for a small, subtle badge that some carried: Super Scenicruiser. But to the drivers, they were entirely new machines. The difference was night and day. A driver could climb into the cab, press the starter, and hear the singular thunderous roar of the V8. No beat frequency, no shuddering. When they let out the clutch, the bus simply moved. The 8V71 had distinct torque characteristics. You had to rev it high, drive it like you hate it, as the old-timers used to say. But it responded every time. The 4-speed transmission was predictable. You could find a gear without praying to the engineering gods.
The Super Scenicruiser was the bus that saved the legacy. The reliability numbers skyrocketed. Maintenance costs plummeted. The buses could now run for hundreds of thousands of miles with only routine oil changes and filter swaps. The retrofit was so successful that it extended the life of the Scenicruiser fleet by nearly 2 decades. These buses, which were considered lemons in 1956, were still hauling passengers across America in 1975. Some even stayed in service into the late 70s, racking up millions of miles. This engineering redemption story is rare. Usually, when a vehicle is that flawed, it is quietly swept under the rug and forgotten. The Edsel, the Chevrolet Vega, these failures were buried. But the Scenicruiser was too valuable, too beautiful, and too important to die. The retrofit proved that the initial concept, the land yacht, was sound. It was just the technology that had failed the vision. Once the technology caught up, the Scenicruiser became the icon it was promised to be. However, the Super Scenicruiser era wasn't just about fixing mistakes. It was about setting a standard. The 8V71 engine and 4-speed Spicer transmission became the industry standard for decades. If you bought a heavy-duty bus in America between 1960 and 1980, chances are it had that exact powertrain. The Scenicruiser had been the sacrificial lamb that forced the industry to develop the heavy-duty components that would power America's logistics for the next 30 years. But there is a final, lingering irony to the story. By the time the Scenicruiser was finally perfected, by the time it was reliable, powerful, and profitable, the world had moved on again. The golden age of bus travel was beginning to fade. The cheap airfares of the jet age were luring away the business travelers and the wealthy vacationers. The interstate highway system was completed, and the family station wagon became the preferred way to see the country. The Scenicruiser, in its perfected form, became a workhorse rather than a luxury liner. It carried soldiers to bases, students to colleges, and families to reunions. It became the background of American life, a reliable, rumbling fixture on the highway. The glamour of the 1954 launch was gone, replaced by the grit of daily service. Yet, even as they aged, they commanded respect. Drivers who had cursed the twin-engine models learned to love the V8s. They became known as the Queen of the Road. There was a specific wave that Scenicruiser drivers would give each other,
a knowing nod that they were piloting the biggest, baddest thing on wheels. They knew they were driving a legend, even if that legend was covered in road grime. As the 1970s drew to a close, Greyhound began to phase them out. They were replaced by the MC8 and the MC9, buses that were boxier, more efficient, and frankly, boring. The Scenicruisers were sold off to second-tier bus lines, church groups, and touring rock bands. They were stripped of their Greyhound logos, painted over in wild colors, and driven until the wheels fell off. But the story doesn't end in the scrapyard, because a machine this unique never truly disappears. In the hands of private owners, the Scenicruiser found a strange and colorful second wind. It became the quintessential tour bus, the vessel of choice for a counterculture that was rejecting the very corporate conformity Greyhound had represented. If you were a rock band in the 1970s or 80s, you didn't want a sterile, modern coach, you wanted a Scenicruiser. The split-level design was perfect for separation. Crew and equipment in the bottom, the band and the party in the top observation deck. They were painted in psychedelic murals, fitted with shag carpet and waterbeds, and driven into the ground. It is a testament to the Marmon Harrington retrofit that these buses, built to run scheduled routes on interstate highways, managed to survive decades of erratic maintenance and heavy touring. They became symbols of freedom in a way Orville Caesar never intended. They were no longer the land yacht of the elite. They were the pirate ships of the highway. But eventually, time conquers all mechanics. As the parts dried up and the frames began to rust, the Scenicruisers slowly disappeared from the roads. They migrated to the backs of dusty lots, to the overgrown corners of rural properties, and to the scrapyards where they were torn apart for their valuable aluminum. Today, spotting a Scenicruiser in the wild is like seeing a ghost. Of the 1,001 originally built, it is estimated that fewer than 200 survive in any recognizable form, and only a handful are still roadworthy. For the brave few who attempt to restore them, the Scenicruiser is still a cruel mistress. The very features that made it an icon are the ones that make it a nightmare to preserve. The famous green-tinted panoramic glass, curved and tempered, is no longer manufactured. If a restorer breaks a side window, they're looking at a custom fabrication bill that could cost thousands of dollars, or a years-long hunt through boneyards to find a survivor that isn't delaminated. The fluted aluminum siding, unique to this model, cannot simply be bought off a shelf. Every restoration is a labor of love and a hemorrhage of money. Yet the enthusiasts persist. They persist because there is nothing else like it. When a fully restored Scenicruiser pulls into a car show or a bus rally, everything else vanishes. The modern million-dollar motorhomes with their slide-outs and satellite dishes look like generic appliances next to the Art Deco majesty of the PD 4501. The Scenicruiser has a face. It has a posture. It looks fast even when it is parked. It smells of diesel and nostalgia. It reminds us of a time when industrial design was allowed to be emotional, when a bus could be more than just a box on wheels. The legacy of the Scenicruiser is complicated. From a purely business standpoint, it was a failure. It cost Greyhound a fortune, tarnished their reputation, and strained their relationship with General Motors. It was a product of hubris, a belief that you could simply engineer your way out of physics. But from a historical standpoint, it was a triumph. It forced the evolution of the heavy-duty diesel engine. It pioneered the concept of the high-deck coach, which is now the standard for touring buses worldwide. It proved that passengers cared about the experience of travel, not just the destination. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Scenicruiser is about the nature of progress itself. Innovation is rarely a straight line. It is a messy, chaotic process full of dead ends and bad ideas. The twin-engine setup was a bad idea, but it was a necessary one. It was the bridge between the underpowered buses of the past and the powerful cruisers of the future. It was a mistake that had to be made so that the industry could learn how to build something better. We look back at the Scenicruiser today not with anger at its flaws, but with affection for its ambition. We forgive the vibration. We forgive the leaks. We forgive the heat. We forgive it because it tried to give us the future before the technology was ready to support it. It was a machine that reached for the stars but kept tripping over its own transmission. And isn't that, in a way, the most human story of all? If you ever have the chance to see one of these silver giants in a museum, or if you were lucky enough to see one rumbling down a country road, take a moment to appreciate it. Don't just look at the Raymond Loewy lines or the shiny siding. Think about the frustrated mechanics in 1955 trying to synchronize two screaming Detroit diesels. Think about the drivers double-clutching their way over the Rockies. Think about the millions of Americans who sat in that upper deck watching the country roll by through green glass, believing that they were riding in the greatest vehicle ever made. The Scenicruiser was a beautiful disaster, a flawed masterpiece, and an unforgettable chapter in the story of how we move. It taught us that being the first to try something new carries a heavy price, but it also earns you a place in history that the safe, reliable, and boring followers will never achieve. It remains, 70 years later, the undisputed king of the road, wearing its scars like medals of honor.